The morning sun had barely cleared the tall walls of Windsor Castle when the royal household stirred to life. It was one of those crisp English mornings where the dew clung to the grass of the private gardens, and the sounds of the estate were just beginning to wake. Inside the private apartments of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the day had started much earlier, fueled by the chaotic energy of three young children. Prince George, at an age where he was beginning to understand the weight of his future role, was already focused, quietly reviewing a school project. Princess Charlotte, confident and ever the organizer, was helping her mother, Catherine, with the day's schedule. But it was Prince Louis, the youngest, full of mischief and boundless energy, who was the true engine of the household this morning. Louis, at 6 years old, was a whirlwind of curiosity, and he had recently discovered a fascination with the mounted soldiers of the household cavalry, the Queen's official bodyguards who stood watch at the official residences. He loved the gleam of their polished breastplates, the plume of their helmets, and the majestic stillness of their horses. To Louis, they weren't just guards. They were knights from the stories his father read to him at bedtime. Today, a small detachment was on duty near the private entrance to the castle, a fact Louis knew very well, having pressed his nose against the glass several times already. His father, Prince William, was in a meeting with his private secretaries, leaving Catherine to manage the morning routine. She watched Louis with a mix of love and exhaustion. He had already tried to build a fort out of the drawing-room cushions and had been gently steered away from helping a footman polish the silver. "Louis, my love," Catherine called, her voice warm but firm. We need to get your coat on. We're going to see Granny later, remember?" Louis, however, was on a mission. He wanted to see the soldiers up close. He wanted to see if they ever moved, or if they were like the statues in the royal mews. While Catherine helped Charlotte with her hair, Louis saw his chance. A door to the inner corridor, usually kept closed, had been left ajar by a member of staff carrying linens. With the stealth of a seasoned spy, Louis slipped through the gap. The corridors of Windsor are a labyrinth of history, lined with portraits of monarchs long past and display cases holding artifacts from centuries of royal history. Louis knew these hallways well, but he had never explored them alone. His small footsteps were silent on the plush red runners. He turned left, then right, his internal compass pointing toward the yard where the guards stood. He passed a window and saw them below, two mounted guards, absolutely still, their horses equally composed. He was close. Down a final, less frequented passageway that led to a rear service door used by staff to access the gardens and the mews, Louis pushed against a heavy oak door. It creaked open, and he slipped outside into the cool morning air. He was in a small courtyard, cobbled and shaded, a far cry from the grand forecourts, and there, just a few feet away, stood one of the knights. He was a young trooper of the Blues and Royals, his uniform immaculate, his sword hanging at his side. And he was positioned here for a reason, a secondary internal security point. But to Louis, he was a giant. The trooper, whose name was Jack, had been on duty for just over an hour. It was a quiet post, mostly ceremonial, but the training was real. He was there to monitor this access point to ensure no unauthorized person entered the private areas from the gardens. He heard the creak of the door, and his eyes, trained to scan, immediately caught the movement. For a split second, his mind registered a security breach, a small intruder. Then his brain processed the face. It was a face he had seen in the newspapers, on the news, a face that belonged to the youngest son of his future king. Before Jack could react, before he could decide on the correct protocol for a royal child wandering into his security zone, Louis had closed the distance. He was standing directly beside the trooper's horse, a large, dark bay gelding named Titan. Titan, sensing the small, yet excited presence, flicked his ears back but remained professionally still. Louis, however, wasn't looking at the horse. He was staring up at the soldier. "Are you a real knight?" Louis asked, his voice a loud whisper in the quiet courtyard. Jack remained still, his eyes fixed forward as per his training when in a ceremonial post. But he could feel the child's presence. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, hoping the boy would get bored and go back inside. He was a soldier, not a tour guide. He was there to guard, not to entertain. Louis, however, interpreted the lack of response as an invitation to continue. He reached out a hand and touched the soldier's gleaming black boot. "Your boots are very shiny," he observed. "Do you polish them yourself?" Jack remained stoic, a statue of discipline, but inside his heart was pounding. He had no idea what to do. If he moved, if he spoke, he was breaking protocol. If he didn't, the situation was escalating. Suddenly, there was a sharp, anxious call from inside the castle. "Louis! Louis!" It was Catherine's voice, and she was close. The alarm had been raised. Within seconds, the heavy oak door burst open. A royal protection officer, a serious man in a dark suit, was the first out, his eyes scanning the courtyard for threats. Behind him came Catherine, her face a mask of worry that immediately melted into relief, and then hardened into the stern expression of a mother whose child has given her a terrible fright. "Louis William Charles!" Catherine's voice cut through the air. "You come here this instant!" Louis, startled by the tone of his mother's voice and the sudden arrival of adults, instinctively took a step back. He stumbled on the uneven cobblestone. To steady himself, he grabbed onto the first thing he could reach, the trooper's leg. The sudden, an unexpected weight and movement caught the soldier off guard. In a purely reflexive action, a tiny automatic shift to maintain his own balance and the composure of his horse, the trooper's hand moved. It wasn't a push, not an act of aggression. It was the slightest of adjustments, his hand briefly touching the small shoulder beside him as he subtly leaned away to check on his mount. But to a 6-year-old who had just been startled by his mother's shout, the contact felt abrupt and frightening. Yet Louis let go and stumbled back, his lower lip trembling. The royal protection officer was there in an instant, placing himself between the child and the soldier, his eyes boring into the young trooper. Catherine scooped Louis into her arms, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's all right, baby. It's all right. Mummy's got you," she whispered, holding him tight. But Louis, in the sudden silence, his fright turning into the need for comfort and explanation, he pointed a small finger at the immobile soldier and said the 6 words that would echo through the corridors of power for weeks. "Mummy," he whimpered, his voice thick with tears. "He injured me." The world seemed to freeze. The protection officer's face became a granite mask. Catherine's arms tightened around her son, and young Trooper Jack, standing rigidly at attention, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had not injured the child. He was certain of it. But the words had been spoken. And in the world of royal security, those words were a 5-alarm fire. Back inside the warm, private apartments of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the atmosphere had shifted from the usual morning bustle to something far more tense. Catherine had carried Louis all the way back inside, refusing to put him down. She sat with him on a small settee in her private sitting room, her arms wrapped tightly around him as a team of royal doctors were urgently summoned. The room, usually filled with family photographs and the soft colors of Catherine's favorite flowers, now felt sterile and cold. Louis, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and his mother's palpable fear, had stopped crying. He was now quiet, his small body pressed against his mother's side, his eyes wide as he watched the adults move around him with grave expressions. Catherine gently examined his shoulder, the spot he had pointed to. There was nothing there, no redness, no bruise, not even a mark. She ran her fingers over his skin, probing gently. "Does this hurt, my love?" she asked softly. Louis shook his head. Does this? Another shake. He seemed perfectly fine, physically. But the words, "he injured me," had already been transmitted. A senior member of the Royal Protection Command had been notified, and protocol dictated that when a member of the royal family, especially a child, makes such an allegation, a full and immediate investigation is mandatory. There were no exceptions, no allowances for the fact that the accuser was 6 years old and prone to dramatic storytelling. The machinery of the palace's security apparatus had been activated. Prince William arrived moments later, his face pale with concern. He had been in a briefing with his staff when the message was relayed. He strode into the room, his eyes immediately finding his wife and son. He knelt beside them, his voice low. What happened? Is he all right? Catherine relayed the sequence of events as she understood them. Louis slipping out, finding him in the courtyard with the guard, and then Louis's statement. She kept her voice even, but William knew her well enough to hear the underlying tremor. He looked at Louis. "Louis, look at me," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "What happened with the soldier? Did he hurt you?" Louis, sensing the gravity of the moment, looked at his father. He thought about it. The soldier hadn't been mean. He hadn't shouted. He had just been standing there like a toy that had come to life. Louis shook his head slowly. "He was standing," he said quietly. "I fell. He touched me." William and Catherine exchanged a look. The story was shifting, becoming less clear, but the damage was done. A few minutes later, there was a discreet knock, and a senior palace official entered. He bowed slightly. "Sir, ma'am, the trooper has been removed from his post. He's being held in a security office while a preliminary inquiry is conducted. The commanding officer of the household cavalry has been informed and is on his way." William stood up, his jaw tight. He felt a surge of pity for the young soldier, a man who was simply doing his job, who now found himself at the center of a potential diplomatic and public relations catastrophe. But he also understood the rigid necessity of the protocol. The safety of his children was non-negotiable. If there was even a 1 in a million chance that a guard posed a threat, that guard had to be removed and investigated. It was a cold, hard reality of the life he was born into. Meanwhile, in a stark, windowless office in a secure part of the castle complex, Trooper Jack sat on a hard plastic chair. He was still in his full-dress uniform, the metal of his breastplate cold against his racing heart. And across from him sat 2 men, a stern-faced officer from the Royal Military Police and a detective from the Royal Protection Command. His ceremonial sword and sidearm had been taken from him the moment he was escorted from his post. He felt naked, exposed, and terrified. "Tell us again from the beginning," the detective said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Every detail, exactly what you did and what the child did." Jack swallowed hard. "I was at my post, sir. Standard duty." The door opened, and the young prince came out. He approached me. He asked if I was a knight. I did not respond. It would have been a breach of protocol. He then touched my boot. I remained still. Then the door opened again. The princess and the protection officer came out. The princess called out. The prince, startled, stepped back and stumbled on the cobbles. He grabbed my leg to steady himself. In that moment, I shifted my weight to keep my balance and to ensure my horse remained calm. My hand may have touched the prince's shoulder or arm, I'm not sure. It was not a push. It was not forceful. It was purely reflexive. Then the protection officer was there, and the princess took the boy inside. The 2 investigators listened, their faces giving nothing away. They had already reviewed the preliminary report from the protection officer. They had already examined the young prince's shoulder. There was no evidence of any injury. And they had also interviewed the protection officer who had witnessed the final seconds of the incident. His account largely matched the trooper's. The prince had stumbled, the soldier had reacted. It looked, on the surface, like an unfortunate accident, a misunderstanding born of a child's fear and an adult's rigid adherence to protocol. But the words, "He injured me," hung in the air. They couldn't be ignored. The investigation would have to be thorough. It would have to be meticulous. And until it was complete, Trooper Jack's career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom hung in the balance. The simple act of standing guard had just become a nightmare. The news, as it always does in the age of instant communication and insatiable public appetite for royal stories, began to leak. It started as a whisper on a royal correspondent's Twitter feed. Incident at Windsor involving a junior royal. Palace tight-lipped. Then the speculation began. Within hours, and the whispers had grown into a roar. The tabloids splashed the story across their front pages with the kind of headlines that sell newspapers but bear little resemblance to the truth. "Royal Guard attacks Prince Louis," screamed one, fabricating details from thin air. "Prince William's fury at soldier who injured his son," claimed another, inventing an emotional response from the future king. The story had taken on a life of its own, like a monstrous distortion of the events in that quiet, cobbled courtyard. Inside the palace, the communications team was in crisis mode. They issued a brief, carefully worded statement. An incident occurred involving Prince Louis and a member of the household cavalry. The matter is being dealt with internally. It would be inappropriate to comment further while a review is underway. The statement, intended to dampen the flames, only added fuel to the fire. If it was a minor incident, why the secrecy? What were they hiding? The pressure on the household was immense. There were calls from certain quarters for the soldiers' immediate dismissal. Politicians with little understanding of the facts made grandiose statements about the protection of the royal family. The public, fed a diet of sensational headlines, was divided. Some called for the soldier's head. Others, sensing a witch hunt, rallied to his defense, and pointing out the absurdity of a highly trained professional attacking a child in full view of a protection officer. Behind the palace walls, the investigation continued with painstaking precision. The cobbles had been examined for any unevenness that could have caused a trip. The trooper's uniform had been inspected for any hidden weapons or sharp objects. There were none. His service record was pulled. It was exemplary. He had been a model soldier, with glowing reports from his superiors and no history of disciplinary issues. He had been selected for the ceremonial duty at Windsor precisely because of his reliability and steady temperament. The protection officer who had witnessed the event was interviewed multiple times, his account cross-referenced and analyzed from every angle. He remained consistent. The prince stumbled. The soldier made a minor adjustment. There was no aggressive action. Then, and the most crucial part of the investigation took place. A child psychologist, retained by the palace to ensure the prince's well-being, was asked to speak with Louis. The meeting took place in the nursery, a room filled with toys and books, familiar and safe. The psychologist, a warm and patient woman named Dr. Evans, didn't ask Louis about the soldier directly. Instead, she played with him. They built towers with blocks, drew pictures with crayons, and talked about his favorite things, his toys, his friends at school, the family dog. Slowly, gently, she steered the conversation. "Louis, I heard you met a soldier the other day. That must have been exciting. I love their shiny uniforms, don't you?" Louis, absorbed in drawing a picture of a horse, nodded. He was standing very still, like a statue. "Like a statue? That sounds funny," Dr. Evans said, chuckling. "Did you talk to him?" "No," Louis said, concentrating on his drawing. He didn't talk. I touched his boot. It was shiny." "And then what happened?" Louis paused, his crayon hovering over the paper. "Mummy shouted. It was loud. I got a fright and I fell. The statue moved. He touched me. Then the man in the suit came. The man in the suit is a protection officer, isn't he? He helps keep you safe. Yes, Lewis agreed. Then, after a pause, he looked up at Dr. Evans with the clear, direct gaze of a child. Mummy was scared. I was scared. I told Mummy he injured me. But he didn't. Not really. I was just scared. Dr. Evans smiled gently. Thank you for telling me, Louis. It's okay to be scared sometimes. The psychologist's report was clear and unequivocal. In her professional opinion, Prince Louis had not been the victim of an assault. His initial statement was the reaction of a frightened child seeking comfort from his mother, an exaggeration of a moment of fear, not a factual account of an injury. And the physical contact from the soldier was, in all likelihood, a reflexive, non-aggressive response to an unexpected situation. The report landed on the desk of the senior palace official leading the investigation. He read it carefully, then read it again. It was the final piece of the puzzle. He picked up the phone and called the commanding officer of the household cavalry. Major, he said, I think we have all the information we need. It's time to close this inquiry. The decision was made to handle the resolution with the utmost discretion, a delicate operation to undo the damage caused by the initial leak and the subsequent media frenzy. Trooper Jack was summoned to the office of his commanding officer, Colonel Sir James Montgomery, a man with a distinguished career and a reputation for fairness. Jack walked in, his uniform once again immaculate. But the strain of the past few days was visible in the tightness around his eyes and the pallor of his skin. He had barely slept, existing on a diet of adrenaline and dread. Colonel Montgomery looked at the young man standing before him. He saw a good soldier, a man who had been caught in a perfect storm of circumstance. At ease, trooper, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Please sit down. Jack sat, his back ramrod straight, his hands resting on his knees. And he braced himself for the worst. Dismissal from the regiment, a dishonorable discharge, the end of a career he had worked so hard to build. The colonel leaned forward, folding his hands on his desk. The internal review into the incident at Windsor has been completed, he began. Every piece of evidence has been examined. Every witness has been interviewed multiple times. The testimony of the Royal Protection Officer, the physical evidence at the scene, and the independent report from the child psychologist have all been taken into account. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Jack held his breath. The review has concluded that there is no evidence to support the allegation that you assaulted or injured Prince Louis, the colonel stated clearly. Your actions have been deemed to be within the acceptable parameters of a soldier's reflexive duty while on guard. You did not breach protocol. You did not act with malice or aggression. The incident was an unfortunate misunderstanding, exacerbated by a child's fear and a highly stressful situation. Jack felt the air rush out of his lungs. A wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. He gripped the arms of the chair to steady himself. Thank you, sir, he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. Don't thank me, trooper. Thank the facts, the colonel replied. However, you must understand the nature of the world we operate in. While you have been exonerated internally, your face has been plastered across every newspaper and website. Your name is known. For your own safety and for the security of the royal family, it would be impossible for you to return to a public-facing ceremonial role. You would be a target for every crank and obsessive out there. Therefore, you are being reassigned. Jack looked up, a flicker of anxiety returning. Reassigned? You have an exemplary record, the colonel continued. Your superiors speak highly of your discipline and intelligence. Effective immediately, you are being transferred to a training regiment. You will work in an instructional capacity away from the public eye. It is not a punishment. It is a new opportunity. In time, when the public's attention has moved on, your career can continue to progress. This incident will not be on your permanent record. As far as the army is concerned, you were cleared of all wrongdoing. Jack nodded slowly. It was not the posting he had dreamed of, but it was a future. It was a second chance. He would not be guarding the royal family, but he would still be serving his country. He would still be a soldier. "One more thing," the colonel said, standing up. He extended his hand. "On a personal note, Trooper, I want to apologize. You did your duty, and you were put through hell for it. The system had to run its course. And I know that course was brutal. I'm sorry for that." Jack stood and shook his superior's hand, a simple gesture that meant more than any formal exoneration. "Thank you, sir," he said again, this time with a steadier voice. As he left the office, walking out into the cool afternoon air, he felt the weight of the past weeks begin to lift from his shoulders. He was still a soldier. He had a future. The nightmare was finally over. For the royal family, the life slowly returned to its carefully orchestrated normalcy. The incident, however, left an invisible mark, a subtle shift in the dynamics of their security and their parenting. There were no more unguarded moments, no more doors left ajar. The protection officers, always present, were now even more vigilant, their eyes constantly scanning for any potential risk, however small. And the balance between allowing the children a semblance of a normal childhood and cocooning them in an impenetrable bubble of security became an even more delicate, more conscious effort. Catherine, in particular,